Welcome back to Fresh Outlook. So let's break it down. Who won and why on Election Day? We'll take a look right now.
Even though turnout was predictably low in this midterm election, people have spoken around the country, and they are now calling for Republicans to be in control on Capitol Hill.
What's the message voters sent in this election?
I think the largest message was that the storyline that this was about Obama was bought by the American public, that it was basically a rejection of what's happening right now in the United States, probably tied to two things, but maybe Ebola, maybe ISIS, and maybe still a stagnant economy.
Typically, midterms see an older voter, not the younger core we saw the last two presidential election cycles.
The traditional base that was present for Obama in 2008 and 2012 didn't show up. And I think the same thing probably happened with people of color yesterday as well. And it's not just how people feel, but who shows up at the polls.
Everyone who voted.
With his low approval rating, President Obama also wasn't campaigner-in-chief this time around.
Many of the Democrats wanted to stay away from him. And it reminiscent for me of the 2000 election where Al Gore did not want Bill Clinton coming out on the campaign trail. I think that was a strategic mistake for Al Gore, and I think it was a mistake yesterday as well.
We've sent a Republican to the United States Senate.
So now, with Republicans the majority in both houses, political analyst Bill Rosenberg believes John Boehner in the House and Mitch McConnell in the Senate want to make deals and pass legislation, but
the issue is whether or not the Democrats and Republicans are going to be able to find the common ground in the nuts and bolts. I think they're going to find the common ground in terms of the label of the bill. I don't know that they're going to agree on what goes into the bill.
The question, how will the president get along both with Mitch McConnell and with John Boehner going forward? We know there's already a meeting scheduled at the White House for this Friday. Reporting for Ebru News, I'm Kyle Schmoyer.
And we are back with our distinguished panel, and that includes Professor Bill Rosenberg from Drexel University, historian Christopher J. Kline. We have Professor Alain Sanders from St. Peter's University in Jersey City, and via satellite in Washington, D.C., political pundit and author Tom Squitieri. You know, before we talk about the particular winners and losers and what it might look like going forward, the one thing that has not been talked about, which is curious to me, is if the Republicans employ the same, if the Democrats employ the same strategy, where you need 60 votes and they'll filibuster, nothing is going to get past the Senate anyway, and the Republicans don't have 60 votes.
Absolutely.
That's right.
There's going to be. That's why my point about gridlock is there. I mean, the Republicans, while everyone's talking about they've taken control over passing legislation, but they can't get the legislation to actually be in effect unless they get 60 votes. And even then they can't do it because they need 2/3 in the House and the Senate to override a presidential veto.
Now take a look at this map right here. The red obviously are all the Republican districts, the blue, the Democratic district. There's clearly a disparity here, a lot of the middle part of the country in the West and so on. And you notice along the coast, we have very strong Democratic.
I suggested this.
You did suggest this map.
Yeah, you got to be careful about such a map because you got to also put into it the population densities.
Of course, and we understand.
Sometimes this is distorted, but
so this is exactly the point. See, what happens is when this gets flashed up and the public sees it, they say, "Oh, it's an amazing landslide for the Republicans." It's sort of like Ronald Reagan in 1980.
Yes.
It was supposed to have been kind of a mandate election, but in that election, Ronald Reagan did not even get a majority of the Electoral College votes. And Jimmy Carter, even at the depths of everything that was going on with the economy in Iran, still got 42 or 44% of the American electorate. So, I mean, you have to think about really what's going on, not just what the image is of what's going on.
Let me hold you right there. I want to pick up on something Bill said, because I do agree on the gridlock. I think you will see the Democrats using some of the same strategies as the Republicans did. But there's another obstacle course to get through, and that is the differences and really the civil war, in my view, that will exist between the factions of the Republican Party. Now that they have a majority, the Tea Party wing, or the more conservative wing, is not just going to aim at Obama, as they did during the previous 2 years, but they're going to aim their criticism and their objections to the Republican majority. Senator Ted Cruz has made it very clear that he doesn't want to go along with some of the plans that Mitch McConnell has.
Well, that's why you don't want to be John Boehner, or you don't want to be Mitch McConnell right now.
So you've got two basic obstacle courses to travel through.
Let's talk about some of the firsts we had on Election Day. The election of the first Iraq War veteran to the U.S. Senate. Significant?
I think it is significant. I think it represents kind of like a new generation that, in the U.S. Senate, and I think it's a good thing. I mean,
this is a path that has been traveled before, obviously, a veteran of any war ending up in Congress.
And now we've ended up with no more members of the greatest generation, those who fought in World War II, in Congress anymore.
Yeah.
So it's just an evolution across time.
Yeah.
Tom Squitieri in Washington, D.C., what do you make of the first female African-American congressperson? What do you think of that election in Utah?
Mia Love from Utah, yeah. She came close a couple years ago, winning. And she's a really dynamic person. She has Haitian background. She's been very committed to public service and helping others, and is considered a progressive in the old sense of the word of trying to make parties work together. So it'll be interesting to see her in Washington, and I'm looking forward to her spirit as well.
What does that say to the Republicans? Is it a message to the rest of the party that we are inclusive?
They're gonna sure try to say that. It's ironic that she's elected from Utah, which is not considered a state that has a lot of minority representation across the board. That being said, think about Barack Obama when he burst onto the national scene when he gave a speech at the Democratic Convention in 2004. It's the same kind of spirit. She's dynamic, she's intelligent, she actually has ideas about what she wants to see in government and how government should work or could work. I think it's a breath of fresh energy for the Republican Party with the added advantage of the obvious visual impact of an articulate young black woman.
And she is also a Mormon on top of all of that. Let's talk about some other firsts here. We had
on top of all of that.
Yes. We had the first African-American senator elected in the South since Reconstruction. That's Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina. What do you read into that?
That's a historic move. I mean, of course, black Republicans did get elected during the Reconstruction era of the United States, and this is sort of a historic reminder of that era, and it's a historic moment. But I would be careful, okay, because I tend to think of firsts in electoral politics, particularly in congressional electoral politics, a little bit like baseball. Electoral politics in Congress is statistically laden. I mean, all kinds of statistics, and so we can come up with all kinds of firsts. So I think it's interesting to note the first because they speak to our nation's diversity, and so that's the significance of it. But in terms of will it have a policy impact? I mean, Senator Scott is a Republican, and he's a conservative Republican, and you can expect him to vote that way. What is significant, of course, is that he's coming from the black community, which is a community that you would expect to vote and a liberal Democratic. But I think what dominates is where these people come from ideologically. The firsts are simply a statement of our diversity, and we should celebrate that.
All right, historian Chris Kline, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And the way I like to look at first, kind of what you said at the beginning was the macro and the micro. I like to take a look at the first and just kind of over the course of the entire election. You have Mia Love in Utah, you have Tim Scott in South Carolina, and these weren't the only ones. I mean, they meant only African Americans we might want to point out, but at the same time, in terms of women, there, you had Elsie Stefanik, 31 years old, the youngest Republican elected to Congress from upstate New York.
You mentioned young. We also had the youngest lawmakers, Sarah Blair.
In West Virginia.
In West Virginia. Now that says something. She's 18?
That's 18, and to me, that's something else you want to look at in terms of the state of West Virginia, because not only was she 18 and elected, but you also had the West Virginia House of Delegates that completely switched, and it looks like the Republicans will now be in control in the state of West Virginia. And I know we can look at nationally, the state of West Virginia went to George W. Bush back in 2000, has voted Republican on the presidential level every cycle, but at the same time, that does represent a trend lower than the federal offices within West Virginia, in addition to Shelley Moore Capito's election to the U.S. Senate in West Virginia.
Tom Squitieri, the gubernatorial races were interesting as well. A lot of Republicans elected, and a lot of them surprisingly elected.
Right next door in Maryland, Hogan defeated the Democratic nominee, and that was a surprise to a lot of people. That was not really on the radar of the pundits, and deservedly so. Even though they saw that race tightening near the end, Maryland's a pretty much Democratic state in presidential elections. It's one of the sure ones for the Democratic Party. And this is interesting to me because we're talking about first a few moments ago. The last two times a Republican has been elected governor of Maryland, it was when a lieutenant governor, a Democratic nominee was a lieutenant governor running. The last time it was Kathleen Kennedy who lost, and now this time it was an African American loss. So Maryland seems reluctant to promote lieutenant governors after an 8-year term of a governor, both who are charged with raising high taxes. It's an interesting local phenomenon. But the Republicans held off a lot of strong Democratic challenges. They lost Pennsylvania, which was pretty much a slam dunk for Democrats. They come out of the governor's races pretty strong in some major states, and as we said in the first segment, the race for the next Republican nomination began on Election Day as well, and we're going to have a lot of players, not necessarily candidates, but a lot of players.
Well, it would seem that way. You know, we've been talking about the Republicans a lot. In New York State, Governor Cuomo handily beat his challenger, Rob Astorino. What do you read into that? Is he preparing for a possible presidential run and just wanted to show that he could win big in a big state?
Well, I think all candidates, including candidates like Chris Christie, wanted the same type of thing. I think there's going to be a real sort of bottleneck in terms for the Republicans. Cuomo, he may want to be a candidate eventually.
For the Democrats,
for the Democrats, but also for the Republicans. They have many candidates, but they also have a lot of roadblocks in front of a lot of them. A lot of the Republican candidates that are senators right now have to decide whether or not they're going to give up their career in the Senate and run for president. People like Ted Cruz, they have a lot at stake in terms of whether they run or not. The other thing I just wanted to go back to for just a moment is this first issue, particularly for African Americans. The individual Tim Scott from South Carolina, you could not find a more conservative individual in the Senate almost, okay? On every social issue, he's all the way to the right. So I think what happens is, in terms of representing blacks, he is African American, but his politics does not represent the African American community. You know, we haven't mentioned, for example, Cory Booker from New Jersey, who also won. So we have two black senators, two black males, about the same age. One is considered more progressive, one is considered more conservative, and they sort of cancel
We have a little
out.
time here left. I think everybody agrees that Hillary Clinton at least goes on the Democratic side as the front runner, but you know, being a front runner doesn't always work in presidential politics. As you know, people
It didn't happen last time.
Exactly. Is there anyone else who can challenge her, legitimately challenge her, and maybe win the nomination?
Right now, it's hard to think of anyone. She really occupies the field pretty solidly.
But don't we have, in a lot of ways, Clinton fatigue?
Yes, Governor O'Malley, or former Governor O'Malley of Maryland, has expressed interest, but of course he's a former governor and his state went Republican, so he loses a little bit of clout there. There's been talk of Senator Sanders of Vermont, not related to me, by the way, but he might be too extreme left on that. Elizabeth Warren, but she has said she's not going to do it. I think she's building up her constituency, she's building up her record for a run later. So right now it's hard to see anybody.
Chris Kline, you've seen this, you're a historian, so you know who's out there.
I think
maybe on the Republican
side. On the
side.
Democratic side, I agree with what everybody said here, and especially with Martin O'Malley and the governor of Maryland. I do think with the election of the Republican, that really kind of dampens his efforts. But at the same time, on the Republican side, I think we should probably be looking maybe towards Ohio. John Kasich had a resounding win, especially in Cuyahoga County around the Cleveland area. And also, I know the other name that's floated around a lot is Scott Walker from Wisconsin.
Well, you got Paul Ryan too. You got Rand Paul.
Scott Walker, though, has won 3 elections in 4 years now, you know, because he survived his recall, and you know, then as you mentioned, Paul Ryan, Rand Paul. Was interesting that Mitch McConnell made a statement on Wednesday that he has his support, you know, so there's definitely a lot of jockeying, and just kind of goes back to the idea that the election for 2016 has already started.
And because there's so much jockeying and there's so many possibilities on the Republican side, that will complicate the Republican strategy in the next Congress, because all of these candidates will be pulling one way or the other to further their presidential ambitions, and the congressional leaders are going to be pushed and pulled as well, and that may stymie them a little bit, because they may not want to take sides in this battle, and it'll complicate matters terribly.
We have 1 minute left. The Tea Party influence as well.
Well, I think the Tea Party, this came up earlier in the show today, I think actually had a little different read on it than the other panelists. I think Boehner actually gains here, because since the Republicans extended their majority in the House, he can afford to offend some of the Tea Party people and make deals, in a sense, with Democrats to pass some legislation. So in my reading of all the press that came out, all the newspaper articles, you hardly saw the word Tea Party anywhere. So they've been effectively subrogated in the Republican Party, and I think their day is probably somewhat past them by. It's going to still rise up again if we have Ted Cruz's and Rand Paul's, but I think they've been pushed a little bit aside.
We got to leave it there. Professor Rosenberg, thank you. Professor Sanders, thank you. You'll be staying. We thank you for stopping by. Always a great historical perspective, Chris Kline. We appreciate it. All right, when we return, we'll we'll look at some of the specific issues that could be on the table as the Republican-controlled Congress maps out the next 2 years and, along with Democrats, prepares for the aforementioned 2016 presidential election.